Hello and welcome to IoT Builders. This is a live stream where we discuss a range of topics on the Internet of Things, starting from embedded devices to cloud services, all from the IoT Builder perspective. Today is May 17th, and this is the episode 29th of our weekly live stream. My name is Nenad, and I'm a senior developer advocate for IoT at AWS. And in this episode today, we'll talk about the role of IoT in climate change and renewable energy. Quite interesting topic, specifically to me, but I hope for the other IoT builders as well. And joining me in this discussion, we'll have Jeff from 1.5 Degrees Ventures. So let me bring him in. Hi, Jeff. How's it going?
Hi, Nenad. Happy to be here. It's going pretty good. The sun is shining, weather's nice, can't complain.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so perhaps we can start with you introducing yourself.
Introducing myself. So you already said I'm a partner at 1.5 Degrees Ventures. We are a climate tech venture builder based here in Berlin, and we work to help startups come into existence that have the potential to reduce at least 100 megatons of CO2 every year by the time that they've scaled up to be a unicorn. So that's what I'm doing. Previously in my life, I started out my career as an embedded engineer, so programming, also electrical engineering, and moved through, well, across the ocean, originally from Washington, D.C., to working from startups, big industries, and telco and automotive, and now trying to give a little bit back.
Excellent. Quite an interesting story there. But yeah, since we are talking with the IoT builders, and you are now working with this climate change and renewable energy, I would like to hear your hypothesis on like how those two worlds kind of meet. So maybe we can start with that easy question.
Easy questions are always good. I think the thing that people need to understand about climate change is it is not one thing but many things. It's sort of all different aspects of our society, but it's primarily physical things. And there's a lot of things you can do with software, and there's this quote famously, software is eating the world. And the question is what happens after software is done eating the world, what's left, what's been digested. If we look at the sources of climate change, and there are lots of different ways to look at it, you can slice the pie this way or that way, uh, but like major blocks, something like 20% is coming from buildings, something like 15% is coming from transport, energy use in industry is 25%, agriculture 10%. So these sort of physical processes that are happening in the physical world. And if you want to influence those things, you can't just make a new web app or mobile phone or something like that. And it's not particularly helpful to have a new kind of bank account or something that shows you, okay, today, because you rode your bike instead of taking public transit, you saved however many grams of CO2, which are immediately erased in the 3 seconds of production from the local factory. So really getting into the climate change topic invariably leads to an IoT use case. Whether you're looking at the production processes in heavy industry, whether you're looking at changing how liquid hydrocarbons are formed and distributed, or simple things like how the energy grid works and the energy generation versus usage. All of those things require current information. What's the current state? They require central coordination. How do we act based on this knowledge that we've gained? And improvement. How can we change these processes to have the whole thing work better or more efficiently? And how do we get the desired result? In the past, the desired result was almost always cheaper. It needs to be cheaper. When you have really high electricity costs, cheaper also means, well, when you have the energy mix in Germany, it's 40% coal,
Mm.
Less electricity means better for the environment. But if you, as a big corporation, maybe a manufacturer, maybe an energy company, want to reduce your climate impact, first you need to understand what it is, and then you need to be able to make these changes to your core behaviors that can enable this reduction. And that only happens through connected devices.
No, excellent. I like this. So kind of, if I understood it correctly, what you're saying is like throughout these industries that are, producing energy, if we are able to measure throughout the processes of like production or transportation of energy or whatever, if we are able to measure this and then make it adaptive so that if there is a need, we can bump up the energy production, and then if there is like no need, we can reduce it down in a manner of like reducing the time of like this adaptivity, right? And
Right.
yeah.
And
Mhm.
that's grid load response. I think I want to be super careful here.
Yes.
There's something called Jevons paradox, and this is from the 1800s. There was a British economist who
Mhm.
realized that as the efficiency of coal went up, so you got more heat, it lasted longer, things like that, just from better furnaces or what have you.
Mhm. Mhm.
Rather than people using less coal, they used more. And so, if your sole goal is to measure and increase efficiency,
Mm.
you may actually inadvertently cause an increase in demand, which is to say, more emissions, more energy use. And specifically, when it comes to energy, there's two main things that cause that. The first is if you make the devices or consumption more efficient, well, you're just going to use more of it because now you can get more economic benefit for the same amount of
Yes.
input. And the second one is everything in our whole society is tied to the price of energy. And so if you make energy more efficient, it's almost equivalent to making energy itself less expensive.
Yes.
And if you have less expensive energy, it causes a macroeconomic growth effect, which means that there's going to be more consumption overall. And so when I'm talking about using data and control on
Mhm.
these industrial processes and things like that, it's not exclusively about making things more energy efficient, but rather about being able to optimize for varying conditions.
Can you give
If I let
examples?
me maybe
Yeah.
with an example. So,
Exactly.
an example, if we look at things like airplanes. So, airplanes,
Mhm.
the ones that are flying now, many of them were built more than 20 years ago, and many of them will still be flying in 20 years. We're not going to get any hydrogen or battery or whatever alternative kinds of propulsion airplanes into wide commercial service in the next 5 to 10 years. Very unlikely. And even if we do, all of the planes that are currently flying now are still going to fly. So, planes, jet engines particularly, are a great example of something that are almost as efficient as they can possibly be because a direct line between the
Mhm.
cost of the fuel to the cost of the flights to the profit can be drawn. So, getting more efficiency from flights and routing them more intelligently and all this kind of stuff, if it could be done, it has probably already been done because there's a direct profit motive to do so. So, how can we then reduce the climate impact of these planes that are flying right now without talking about changing propulsion and things like that, which is going to anyway take 20 years?
Yeah.
So, the primary way is through sustainable aviation fuel. There are two routes to get sustainable aviation fuel. One is the biofuels route, and that's where you take old fryer grease, or you have yeast making ethanol, like brewing or
Mhm.
distilling, and then you refine that up into jet fuel. There's a lot of steps involved there. Each step is a little bit not super efficient, so the overall efficiency of the process is terrible, but at the end you have a fuel with a at least a zero CO2 net balance. There's some effects from burning things at a higher altitude, and contrails have also some effect, but basically that's as good as you can get. The other approach are e-fuels. So this is fully synthetic hydrocarbons. You start with water and a source of CO2, whether that's
Hmm.
captured from a smokestack or coming off of a landfill or something like that. And then you sort of magic alchemy chemistry them together into basic hydrocarbons, and then you magic alchemy chemistry them into really heavy hydrocarbons, and then you basically refine them. You put them in a thermocracker like you do with stuff you drill out of the ground, and then at the end you have airplane fuel. So that magic alchemy stuff is not magic nor alchemy, but it is organic chemistry. And the primary processes were known to us, were discovered in the 1800s. So there's not anything new under the sun. But almost the same way that the efficiency of the planes has a direct impact on the price and the price of the tickets and profit, when you're synthesizing fuel like that, the number one, two, and three cost factors are the price of electricity.
Mm.
So, how do you get electricity as cheap as possible? Well, you connect directly to renewables. You skip the grid, you skip transmission, you plug directly into a wind farm, a solar farm, hydroelectric, if you have it. There's just one issue. Chemical processes, that kind of magic alchemy stuff, does not like being started and stopped.
Mm.
It prefers to run at a steady stoichiometric ratio, steady temperature, steady all of these things. So if you're connected directly to a wind farm and the wind starts blowing, you have a problem, or the sun goes
Yes.
down and now you have
Yes.
a problem. So being able to take these sort of existing, well-known, well-characterized chemical reactions and one, change them so that they can be dynamic and reactive based on
Hmm.
the availability of power, based on the current price of electricity from the grid, based on the weather forecast. If you know tomorrow is going to be cloudy but very windy, you can already make some changes. But also to get really deep into the process control for these industrial chemistry things and say, okay, this stage we can run, and then the output of this stage we're going to store. We're not going to keep going because we know we're going to have enough of that for the next stage later. What I'm describing, this sort of industrial
Yeah.
control system, that's nothing other than industrial IoT. And if you have one of these plants, it's nice. But if you have hundreds of these plants and
Hmm.
you don't have them centralized, you have them near the point of use, you put them next to airports and things like that, then they can, in layman's terms, they can learn from each other. If you find at one
Yes.
of these plants a process improvement, because they're all connected, they're all in the same sort of management plane, they can share their learnings with each other, and the overall efficiency, you get network effects from your refineries, basically. And this is a fantastic example for why IoT isn't a nice to have, but it's actually a full requirement to be able to decarbonize some of these industries. If you don't have the information, the real time control, command and control of your infrastructure and industrial processes, you're not going to be able to offer these better for the environment alternatives at a price
Hmm.
point that's competitive. And where we find ourselves, you need to have a price competitive
Yes.
product to be able to be successful.
Yes, yes. I remember you said this a couple of times, like this, distributed systems and mesh network, and you can directly apply this to what you were saying also when it comes to industries as well. Like even the society as a role, as a whole, is kind of working as a distributed system. So, yeah,
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at IoT devices as a distributed system, which you should, if you're
yes,
listening to this podcast, for sure you do, then when you look at the energy use in society, or lots of people talk about value chains, and the truth is, there's not really one value chain. There's a directed acyclic graph of value that flows from energy through to the end use of whatever is being done with that energy. And being able to understand at each point in this graph sort of what are the inputs and what are the outputs and how is everything
hmm,
connected with everything else is critical to being able to find new ways to accomplish things without pumping oil out of the ground. I think there's another really cool example, and that was a pun, and you'll find out why in a second. You
Okay.
have thousands and thousands of grocery stores, and the
Hmm.
grocery stores have freezers and coolers, and they keep stuff within a certain range. That is nothing else other than a giant energy storage or energy shifting mechanism. So if all of those coolers and freezers were connected, you knew what the temperatures were, you can correlate it with the current grid price of electricity, the current generation, what is the mix, how CO2 intensive is the energy right now. Maybe overnight the power is a little bit more expensive and not so nice for the environment, so you can allow things to drift up a little bit. Of course, you want to keep them within the range for
Yeah.
health and safety. But then during the day, when there's lots of solar or wind, you actually make your frozen goods a little bit colder. So you go deeper as you have this huge inertia. And this
Mm.
kind of thermal energy storage is not just something you can do in grocery stores. It's something that makes a lot of sense for process heat. It's something that makes sense for heating and cooling in buildings. And once you start seeing everything as this interconnected
Yeah.
energy usage, I can
Yes.
shift from here to here, and all of these kind of stories, like having electric cars that are acting to balance out the grid.
Yeah.
All of these stories are one, they require some aspect of connected devices and IoT, what we used to call M2M, right?
Yeah.
They
Yes.
all require it, and two, you can't get around it. You have to be doing this. Otherwise, someone else is going to do it and they're going to beat you on price or availability or efficiency.
Yes.
And it's just an unfair advantage that you can't avoid.
Yes, I did have a discussion also that like the cloud service. I mean, AWS is a energy to CPU cycles converter, right? So, so at the end of the day, like yeah, you process information, and for that you need energy, and that's what you kind of pay for more or less. Like if you, of course, uh, kind of reduce all the other things that goes into play, but at the end of the day, that's what it is, right? So.
Yeah. And the major costs at data centers are not for the computers or not for the computing, it's for the cooling.
Yeah,
And it
exactly.
used to be you
Yes,
would pay for space, and now you pay for cooling capacity. And so
exactly.
there's, what do we do with the hundreds of megawatts of slightly warmer than ambient air that gets exhausted from all the data centers? Well, throw it into a heat pump, throw it into the district heating network. I
Yes.
mean, you've basically got a giant distributed set of resistance electric heaters. What can you do with that heat?
Yeah. Yeah. That's exactly how it should be. But speaking of these things, maybe can you talk about some interesting projects that you're working on right now? Yeah.
Lots of interesting stuff. I try these days not to take anything new because I know that if I do, then I will have even less time to play with my cats or go outside. Um, I think relevant for your audience are there's two things. So one of our portfolio companies is working on a new microinverter, and context, you have these big solar farms and
Hmm.
you've got these rows and rows and rows of panels, and it is not particularly efficient to send medium DC power any appreciable distance. So if the voltage you get off of a set of panels is 30 or 40 volts, if you put that in a copper wire and send it a kilometer, then it's already not a lot. So the thing to do is at the point of generation, you convert it to alternating current. And if you're curious why that's a good idea, go look up Edison and Tesla and all of that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Anyway, the thing that does that is called a microinverter. And what's really interesting is there is a trend towards people wanting to bring this solar generation not out in a field somewhere far away, but close to where it's being consumed. So that means panels on your roof, panels on your balcony,
Yeah.
panels on your garage, panels sort of near you. And for that, you also need a microinverter. But this would be then a grid tie microinverter where you're not just generating the power and putting it somewhere else, but you're directly, basically, you plug it into a plug in the wall and it becomes part of the energy network. So far, the people who are living in apartments or homes or things like that are using microinverters that were more or less designed to be used out in a field somewhere. So they're big, ugly, hideous things. They have industrial control systems inside of them. They have
Hmm.
connectors which are rated for thousands of ampere, and the cables are as thick as my arm. They're really ridiculous. So this portfolio company said, "Hey, the status quo is all these things are kind of out there. They're not meant for end consumers, but end consumers are using them anyway. That sounds to me like an opportunity." So they're working on a new generation of microinverter that is designed for consumers. So not just looking nicer, but also easier to understand. Automatically connects up to the cloud. I won't say which cloud, but it starts with three letters and probably has an A and an W and maybe an S in there. And that you can just basically, you take it out of the box, you put it on your balcony. They're so light that you can use Velcro. You don't need to screw anything into the wall, and see immediately the generation from what you put on your balcony. And so there, I'm helping with the firmware on the device. So everything from, on the one hand, the microinverter topology, maximum power point tracking on the panels, to okay, how and when and what kind of data is sent to the cloud. And then some really interesting things happen once you don't have one or two of these things, but 10,000 or 100,000 of them all over the place. Is you can start to do the same kind of load shifting where you say, okay, I know that in this location
Mm.
I'm generating this amount of energy. Maybe now is a good time to run my dishes, or now is a good time to run my dishwasher. Now is a good time to have the compressor on my fridge running. Now is a good time
Nice.
to do my wash. So being able to do this grid intelligent stuff, not top down, but rather bottom up.
Mm.
And so that's really cool. Another interesting project that I'm working on is, there's a startup in Poland which is or has created relatively inexpensive air quality monitors. And I say relatively inexpensive because the ones that are typically allowed for use by governments and local regulations, these are reference laboratory machines which
Hmm.
cost hundreds of thousands, and they're heavy things. And this company's, their secret sauce is they've managed to use relatively inexpensive sensors to get a quality of data that is equivalent or better than these super expensive
Nice.
reference machines. And now the project is about, what does the next generation of this look like? How can we reduce costs? How can we get not just one or two or three, but 100 or 200 or 300 of these sensors out there, so we have better information, so that we can give that information to the local governments to make better decisions about
Hmm.
public transit or school openings or closings based on how bad the pollution is, depending on where you are in the world. That's still a thing that happens. And
Yes.
so that's really, really cool.
Interesting. Really interesting projects, man. So coming back to the first one, I just so for those, is it a requirement to have like a battery buffer when you have like those solar panels and this kind of inverters, or is it?
So it's not a requirement. There is pending EU-wide legislation at the
Hmm.
moment. Every country in the EU kind of has their own rules that would set the maximum amount of power that you're allowed to feed into the network.
Hmm.
And basically, even after that rule comes into effect, the maximum amount of power is something like 800 watts. And what you would find is that taking that power and putting it into a battery, or trying to load shift based
Hmm.
on that amount of power alone, isn't super helpful.
Hmm.
It's far more interesting to use the inertia, the thermal inertia of the
Hmm.
things in your freezer to store that energy,
I
than
see.
it is to have a battery taking up
Interesting.
whatever limited living space you have. Not that it
Interesting.
wouldn't work, but if you can imagine trying to charge or like filling an Olympic-sized pool with a garden hose, right? At some point, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And the same token, we have these kind of buffers and storage and things in our houses already, other
yeah,
than the freezers. And it's more interesting to like move demand than it is to
yeah.
add buffering. Like the same applies in the real world as it does to the internet.
Hmm.
For a long time, the way to solve problems on the internet was, oh, we're having packet loss, add a buffer. And there's this thing called buffer bloat, which again, Google it. I'm not going to explain. Um, but at some point, there was this buffering everywhere, and you couldn't figure out what actually was going on. It was just sort of a super complicated mystery. And people then started trying to find ways around the buffers. So HTTP2 and Quick and all this kind of stuff is trying to avoid a lot of this buffer bloat
Yeah.
problem. And if we're not careful, the same thing will happen to the energy network.
Mm.
There's so absolutely you can add a storage solution, but it's not at all required to see the vast majority of the benefit from such a system.
Yeah, yeah. This is interesting. This is what I wanted to kind of uh, understand, but it is an interesting concept where exactly goes into your point is like trying to leverage the current infrastructure and introduce kind of this censoring mechanics and kind of like acting and being adaptive rather than just overloading with like buffers and adding new bulky pieces to the overall technology. Like
Hmm.
I really really like this trend. I mean, it's I think as you said, you know, coming to this like cost efficiency quite quicker then.
Yeah. I'm just looking at the generation from my solar panels, and it's probably blurry, but I have this nice little graph with a peak in the middle, which
Yeah,
is what
yeah,
you want to see.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I assume you can also make something like if a lot of people are installing those and then in the city, and then you can follow in a central system. You can actually follow the trend and then say, okay, based on the current trend, I can predict that this specific spot will have uh, energy in the next 1 hour, since it's not going to be cloudy and that kind of stuff as well. So you can be more intelligent and then kind of start warming up things or cooling down depending on your needs. So yeah.
Exactly. And I think I mentioned already that a huge amount of energy is just from heating and cooling buildings.
Yes.
And so if you have better information about occupancy or weather or things like
Yes.
that, you're not increasing efficiency. I mean, if you look at it from the building perspective, you're increasing efficiency, but rather what you're doing is you're making the utilization more effective,
Effective. Yeah.
right? You're not heating an
Effectiveness.
empty room, you're not cooling a room that's already cold.
Yeah, that's the thing, is like people mix up the effectiveness and efficiency, and yeah. So what you're focusing on is effectiveness, more or less. Okay, got
Yeah.
it. No, but this is really really interesting topic. But going back to some of the things I wanted to talk about is um, what do you see as like I mean, we briefly touched this, but like future trends now coming into this as we see, the IoT is kind of like that infrastructure that needs to be laid out across all of this what you mentioned, but then you also have the in this kind of measure, act, control, you have the control part. And now, like, AI being popular right now, and this generative AI and all that stuff, machine learning. So what do you see kind of trends coming in this regards?
The There's a short and a long answer. I will try
Okay.
and sort of straddle the middle. From a climate perspective. So from the
Hmm.
climate perspective, the roadmap for success has been laid out. It's been laid out in the IPCC reports, and it's been laid out in the EU Commission's 2050 plan. And so you can see very clearly, I mean, the IPCC report in plain English goes through and says, these are the things we can do. These are the ones that are the biggest bang for your buck.
Hmm.
And so you go into these reports and you see, okay, we're going to be doing this, we're going to be doing this, we're going to be doing this. You see the regulatory changes that are coming from the EU. You see the regulatory changes that are coming from the United States and China. I remember the first time I went to Shenzhen on a trip to get something manufactured, there were two-stroke mopeds all over the place, taxis with like from the 1980s and all sorts of crazy stuff. The last time I was there, or the time after that, maybe 3 years later, all of the taxis were electric, all the buses were electric, all the
Nice.
mopeds were electric, and this sort of government. So governments can't affect supply, right? The government can't wish a bunch of stuff into existence, but they can absolutely affect demand.
Yes.
And whether you're talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the most ridiculous name for anything ever, or you're talking about new EU regulations coming in, we see huge amount of demand for solutions for these big, heavy polluting industries. Uh, I talked earlier about sustainable aviation fuel. There is already a requirement in nearly every EU country that a certain amount of that is mixed into the jet fuel that every plane takes. Those requirements go up over time, so the demand is being pushed by the government there.
Nice.
Sometimes even the threat of regulation is enough. You don't have to actually regulate something. Many people don't know this, but the movie and video game rating systems were created as responses to threats to regulate. They say, okay, before somebody writes some crazy laws, we're gonna do our own thing. And we see that, for instance, the shipping industry. Many of the large players in the shipping industry, they've already ordered new ships, new motors, which run on renewable fuels, even though there's not currently enough supply of those renewable fuels to actually run those boats,
Interesting.
right? So they basically said, "Whoa, we see where this is going. You know, we're going to be there."
Mm.
And so in just about every aspect, from manufacturing, from housing, from commercial buildings,
Mm-hmm.
logistics, whether we're talking about trains, planes, or trains, aeroplanes, trucks, cars, everything is going in the direction of not necessarily how can I be more energy efficient, but rather how can I be more effective with the energy that I'm using now, and how can I switch to alternative energy sources which have a lower carbon intensity.
Mm-hmm.
And the answers to those questions are almost always, so I would say smart, but it's almost like smartphones and smart TVs. They're not called smartphones anymore, they're just phones, and they're
Phones.
not called
Yes.
smart TVs anymore, they're just TVs. And so the solution space for basically the products and services that will fulfill the demand that's being created by the regulations that are passing today are going to be connected devices. They're
Mm.
going to be either distributed or centrally managed. They are
Mm.
going to be for sure with 10 or 20 or 30 microcontrollers. You know, they're going to be extremely well instrumented, and the information and surfaces that they're going to be providing are going to be the tools that we need to really retool society.
Oh, excellent. I like this. And I mean, coming back to this topic, what you said in terms of the cars and the trucks and all that stuff, like the end consumers will never give up their convenience. So if you know, if at the end of the day, um, you don't have a good charging network, what you said is like the things are missing as of now, and if that charging network is not connected, and you don't get the kind of the live view where you can actually charge, and that the charging process is not that you get just plug your car in and then charge and then leave and then the automatically get deducted and all that kind of stuff. If the infrastructure is kind of like not there, the adoption will be slow, right? So this is what you're mentioning. I really like this, is kind of like building out that base infrastructure which is all connected, so that the user experience is seamless, so people
Mhm.
don't have to think about this. So yeah,
Nearly everyone alive today, and in, without geography boundaries, nearly everyone alive today, and probably their parents and the parents before them, have lived during a time where the standard of living, the quality of living, the availability of resources and food and everything has been always improving. The
yes,
future has always been good.
yes,
And where we're standing today, there's a group of people who say, look, the future is not going to be good. We need to start to compromise on our standard of living or quality or energy use or something like that. And I think it is, quite frankly, unrealistic to expect people, even if that may be true, I
yeah,
think it is unrealistic to expect people to
yeah,
accept that.
yes,
And so that means that any sort of solution that you come up with that can reduce climate impact also simultaneously needs to be better than whatever
mm,
they're doing today. And that can be better in terms of user experience, that can be better in terms of less expensive. There's
yes,
lots of different dimensions of
yes,
better, but it needs to be better. You can't ask somebody who's been eating steaks their entire life all of a sudden to eat Beyond Meat and be happy.
yes, yeah. I completely agree on this. That's a really good.
The,
Okay.
the good news is connected devices do give you the potential to make
Yes,
things better.
yes, yes, definitely. But coming to this topic, there is a big concern about security, right? So, like, if you have all of that devices connected, like the data being shared and all that stuff. So, how do you see that happening? Like, what are your security concerns?
For a very long time, I took an extreme hardline stance on security and privacy for connected devices, and
Yeah, I know.
for consumer devices, I still do. But when we're talking about these sort of industrial systems and interconnected grid and things like that, the fact of the matter is many of those things are already connected, right? There's already PLCs in your local substation that are reporting back centrally. You already have ovens and stoves and things which have Wi-Fi connectivity. Most of Samsung's household goods are already connected. And the question, like, what is your threat profile, is
Yes.
the first question you should ask when people talk about security. What are you protecting against? And if what is you're protecting against is some rogue hackers from some rogue state take control of all of your devices and turn it into a giant botnet and DDoS something, and sure, fine, that is a valid threat, and some of the biggest botnet attacks have been unsecured connected security camera things. But if your concern is, oh no, my smart meter is leaking information about how much power I'm currently consuming, and theoretically with AI and magic and the power of imagination, I can use that to figure out when I'm home or not, or what I'm watching on TV, or how big my underwear is. The thing is, security and privacy are absolutely critical things.
Yep.
You should do them right. We have best practices in place. Many of the popular platforms and providers basically don't let you not do it in the right
Yeah.
way.
Exactly.
But as critical as they are, they're not blockers. If
Yep.
you give me two options and you say, okay, on option A is we have a connected electricity grid and it is load responsive and 40% less carbon intensive, but there might be some security holes because we quickly pulled together a bunch of off the shelf stuff and used some glue, and who knows what's lurking underneath. Or we have the same system 20 years later that's completely foolproof, bulletproof, no security holes ever.
Yeah.
uh, and that one is so the same system just 20 years later.
Yeah.
Then please, 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 please give me the fast and secure one now,
Yeah.
because the biggest enemy in climate change that we have is time.
Time. Yeah.
And every ton of emissions today are way worse than the same ton of emissions a month from now, are way worse than the same ton of emissions a year from now, because it's cumulative. So the faster that we can get these solutions out there, we can buy ourselves more time to do better. And quite honestly, we have laws and a legal system and whole ways for countries to mediate when people break the law. And doing this kind of, it's kind of weird to say it out loud, cybercrime. Uh, it's living in a world like Cyberpunk 2077 where a hacker can walk up and take control of your house and make it dance and things like that. For me, other than the fact that it's unrealistic, great, society made it to 2077. We somehow got a hold of climate change. So I'm all for taking appropriate shortcuts in order
Yeah.
to ensure the survivability of our species.
No,
I think there's not a lot
I,
of room to be a hardliner.
yeah, I know. I really like this kind of like, just making a threat model in terms of like what is the priority, and then being conscious about it, and then making that decision and going with it, rather than making sure like everything is super tight, even though that's not possible because there are always this 0 days vulnerabilities. So
And, and quite frankly, if your threat model is an advanced nation state actor takes control of your energy grid, well, I would point you to Europe's largest nuclear power plant, which is currently occupied, right? And just because they're not dropping bombs on it or tanks are rolling into the gate doesn't mean that nation state actors don't have ways to take out your critical energy infrastructure. It's every bit the same in active war, whether it's with bits or with atoms.
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, but all right, cool. This is as I said, like a really interesting discussion, and I really enjoyed this. Um, do you have any, let's say, advices for people who are jumping into this field of IoT and the climate change? So, some of the learnings you had so far that you would like to share, some lessons learned.
Absolutely. I think the number one thing is that it's not too late. It's we've sort of transitioned as a society from climate change isn't happening to yeah, climate change is happening, but it's not so bad to oh, it's definitely happening and we're all screwed. So let's just have a party because there's nothing we can do about it. I think each one of those positions is wrong, and they're wrong for different reasons. But it's not too late. There is still time to bring products and solutions to make the changes to enable us, people, humanity, our planet, our biosphere to survive into the future. And the most important thing that any of the founders in any of our portfolio companies bring is specific industry knowledge.
Mhm.
So whether that's somebody who was working for 20 years in the construction industry or someone who was working in automotive or at an oil and gas company doing offshore, whatever, that industry knowledge, you know what those processes are, you know where there are opportunities for improvement or maybe completely different solutions to solve the same problem. That knowledge is invaluable, and being able to bring that to bear with a technology approach, whether it is a connected device that gets added on or building new kinds of factories or new kinds of things, is how we will progress and how we can be successful.
Yeah, this is what I love about IoT. It is so interdisciplinary that if you don't have people from different backgrounds, perspectives, it's really hard to work. So having all of these people from kind of like what you said, from the industrial sector, from energy or whatever, and then coming and then building out something together. I think it's the most interesting concept of IoT. I mean, even nowadays, it's like, I think we had this in early podcast episodes. It's like you don't buy IoT. The IoT is the infrastructure that allows you to do something, right? So yeah.
Exactly. There's never been a better time to build. This is a generational challenge, maybe an existential challenge,
Yes.
and nearly every aspect of every solution is going to be connected in some way.
Yeah. Excellent. Awesome. I know we talked about random stuff, but you were at one point you were mentioning some birds and the story about the SIM cards and so forth. Maybe you can share that story. I really like that story. Uh,
Yeah, there is. So for a long time, people didn't understand that birds migrated, and it lasted a lot longer than you would think. It was still the mid 1800s, so the time of cowboys and samurai and all this kind of stuff, and pirates. They all existed together at the same time on the world in the mid 1800s. When a couple of birds showed up in Germany with giant spears sticking through their necks. And the spears, total minimal chance, had missed all the vital organs and were balanced just sort of perfectly that the bird could still fly. And they landed somewhere in the middle of Germany. And so a German hunter immediately shot the bird dead. Like, what the hell is that? I'm going to go see. And what they found was this was a spear from the Central African continent. So, like, indubitably, without question, this spear and this bird came from Africa. And this is how they eventually proved that migratory birds migrate and don't just turn into mice or magically appear out of thin air or whatever some of the other explanations were. And if you relate that story to what happened some 150 years later, where scientists were studying migratory birds to see what kind of routes they took, and interesting things like they would go around bodies of water and then continue in
Mhm.
a straight line from where they were. So birds are really, really interesting in general. And to do that, they had basically 2G SIM cards and little modems that they would wrap around their legs. And one month, one of the research institutions that was doing this got a huge bill. So order of magnitude more expensive than what they had gotten previously. And they looked, why is our bill so high? And one of the SIM cards was not anymore attached to a migratory bird, but someone in either North Africa or the Middle East, somewhere in the middle of their migratory path, had taken the bird, poached it while it was resting on its journey, took the SIM card out and said, "Ooh, free data," and had been using it to sort of surf the internet. And so there's this really interesting parallel between how complex interconnected systems work,
Yes.
so migratory birds, how we understand how those systems work, the kind of instrumentation that we have. In the 1800s, it was, oh, there's a random bird with a spear in its neck, and then it's okay. Now we have GPS, IoT trackers, all sorts of cool stuff. To what can go wrong with those
Yes.
systems, where we didn't set up our billing appropriately, or we didn't have any limits, or and then all of a sudden you have, a straight line and then kind of wanders over here for a little bit in the local
Yeah.
village. And of course, because the thing's attached to a tracker, you know exactly where it is. And you go fetch it and say, hey, give us our bird tracker back.
Yeah, the reason why I like this story is because in the previous podcast we talked about a lot about this observability, and then it is a kind of really important layer on top of the overall IoT infrastructure, and a notion that in the previous podcast was introduced by this debugging in production for IoT devices. So this is why I wanted to hear that story once again, because it kind of really paints the point about this kind of like why observability in your initial IoT infrastructure matters, and then that if you have the right tools, you can then act quickly rather than just like having a fictional idea of how things might work, and then not being able to react on it. So, okay.
Absolutely. And I mean, on the topic of production in general, right? It's all well and good to have like an integration and staging and pre-production and all these kind of different environments, but they will never be the scale of your
Yeah,
production environment, assuming that you're successful. If you're not successful, then they'll all be the same size. But assuming that you're successful, your production environment is always going to be orders of magnitude larger, meaning orders of magnitude more devices, orders of magnitude more information flow, and orders of magnitude more weird. Weird things happen when you
yeah,
connect all of these different devices together that you can't predict. And so understanding what's going on is super important. I mean, like there is no pre-production environment for the national electricity grid. And
yes.
nevertheless, you want to know as soon as possible when someone doesn't have power anymore.
Yes, I was about to mention the. So since you started talking, coming back to the very beginnings of the what you were saying, your hypothesis about the IoT and climate change. So what you're saying is like you need to operate this distributed system that's so complex and that's trenched into this real world, and for that, it's really hard to kind of have a pre-production environment. It's almost impossible. So yeah. Cool. Awesome. And this was a pleasure talking to you. As I said, this is one of the my favorite topics blend together. So it's glad that you joined me and kind of started talking about this. But I think the time is running out. So before we leave, so how can people reach out to you?
I think the easiest way to get in touch with us is either through our website, which is the English word one spelled out, and then a period, and then the English word five spelled out, and then a period, and then the English word ventures, so 1.5.ventures, or look me up on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find, so just first name, last name, and
Okay, so is
so I'm
this
I'm more than happy to talk to, let's say, aspiring embedded developers, electrical engineers who have questions. What can I do? Who is looking for help? What needs to be done? I am also more than happy to talk with inspiring high net worth individuals who say, "Hey, I have a load of money, but I'm retired now. What can I do with that money? What makes a good investment, or how do I invest? How do I find the founders who are building climate tech solutions?" If you are interested in synthetic fuels, in heat storage, in construction, in residential buildings, in hydrogen, the hydrogen economy, biofactories, I'm really keen to do something with mycelium, agriculture. Hit me up. We're my job is to find interesting people with interesting technologies and help them get their tech into the market in as many people's hands as quickly as possible. And so if that sounds like you, please.
excellent? This is pretty cool. Awesome, man. Any last things you wanted to say before we close in?
Always sign your packets and don't reinvent the wheel. If you are building a solution, whether it's a climate solution or for something else, probably 90% of the stuff that you need to bring together to make that solution already exists. Spend time working on the thing that makes your thing different and not time working on the stuff which everybody else does.
I love this. This I think we both felt it a couple of times, reinventing the wheel, especially when you're young engineer. So yeah, leveraging whatever is out there, makes life easier.
Reinventing the wheel is fun, but far
Yes.
more fun is millions of people walking around every day using something that you've built.
Yes.
And
Definitely.
doing both of those things at the same time doesn't happen.
It's hard. Yeah. Excellent. I think this is a really good topic to kind of close out now. So thanks a lot for your time. I
Thanks for
hope,
having me.
yeah, I hope our listeners have been enjoying this as much as I did. So yeah, excellent. Then Jeff, till next time, see you,
All right. Ciao.
and everybody, see you later. Bye.